I'd like to focus on the issue of the overrepresentation of the Western European group. Some of you have implied this from the floor. So what I will say here is that the G4 does acknowledge the importance of ensuring fair and balanced representation that reflects today's global realities. And I'm very happy to say that many of you from the floor echoed these very sentiments. It is crucial to emphasize that our proposal seeks to address the historical imbalances within the Security Council while remaining faithful to the principles outlined in the United Nations Charter. Now, as you all know, Article 23(1) highlights the significance of member states' contributions to international peace and security as the primary criterion for membership, and we believe that the criteria of Article 23(1) should also apply to the election of new permanent members. In fact, the overarching and final criteria is that it is the decision of the General Assembly. And I think we should all respect that. The majority sentiment is that the current geopolitical realities need to be represented in both the categories of the Council and that all decisions will be taken by the United Nations General Assembly. Moreover, the proposed reform does not disproportionately increase the representation of Western member states in the Security Council. Rather, it seeks to ensure a more inclusive and representative body that better addresses the diverse challenges facing the international community. Let me just amplify on that. The relative representation of the Western European group with additional permanent seats will actually decrease in an expanded council. Currently, as we all know, there are 2 out of 5 permanent members. And in case, and as and when, the council does expand, they will be 3 out of 11. And with our model, I would also like to stress that Africa and the Latin American community will finally have permanent representation at the United Nations Security Council. However, colleagues, what I would like to emphasize is, and I have said so in the morning as well, that while the G4 has presented its model, it is also keen and eager to negotiate with all in very constructive fashion. I think this point must be stressed. Now, the second point that I would like to make is the representation of small and medium states, the integration of SIDS. Some of you have also raised it from the floor, and so did I stress upon it this point in the morning. Well, I will reiterate that the G4 recognized the importance of ensuring the representation and involvement of small island developing states in the Security Council, and therefore our proposal emphasizes the need for member states to give due consideration to the representation of small island developing states during the nomination and election of non-permanent members. Let me also stress that the G4 does believe that there is a need for greater representation of the various regional groupings in the non-permanent category to better reflect the diversity and plurality of views from 193 member states, and that the same be reflected in an expanded composition in that category of membership. Therefore, the G4 model proposes that member states should give due consideration during the nomination and election of non-permanent members to the adequate and continuing representation of small and medium-sized member states, including SIDS. I do hope this clarifies the matter, because I did notice that some of you raised this matter from the floor. However, that said, I would also like to stress that while we advocate for this principle, we fully understand the complexity of ensuring adequate representation for all diverse groupings of the General Assembly. Such overlap between regional and cross-regional groups does require further discussion. We are more than willing to engage in that discussion. The intention is to promote an approach that fosters inclusivity and participation in the framework of the existing regional groups. And I think many of you stressed that from the floor as well, the point about inclusivity, and so do we. We stress the same point. The other point that I would like to pick up on is democracy balanced with efficiency, and I think some of you have also raised it from the floor in one fashion or the other. Now, I would like to stress that the principle of equity and representation will lead to the creation of a United Nations Security Council, which is more legitimate, thus effective also in its functioning. The G4 firmly believes that expanding in both categories of the permanent and non-permanent seats is crucial for enhancing the equitable representation of the Security Council, and many of you echoed this sentiment. Solely expanding non-permanent seats falls short of achieving this objective, as it ignores the fact that the composition of the permanent membership currently belongs to a 1945 vintage when more than half of the UN member states were not even independent states. So this issue can only be resolved by adding new permanent seats. Now, support for expanding both categories has been significant, no exaggeration here, as evidenced even today by various delegations and groups, including the Africa Group, the Benelux Group, the Nordic countries, L69, the G4, to name just a few, and all but one of the permanent members. The overwhelming majority of member states have already expressed favor for this approach also in 2015. Those of you who were here longer will recall, thus recognizing the need for equitable regional representation. Now again, I will say that we are, however, aware that this might not be the final outcome of the negotiations, and so we remain ready to engage further. I will turn now to the question of the veto. There were many, many questions on this from the floor. I will attempt to answer those questions. Now, in our view, the new permanent members would, as a principle, have the same responsibilities and the same obligations as the current permanent members. The waiver of a veto right for new permanent members until the review in the G4 model is a deliberate choice based on careful consideration of the evolving dynamics within the United Nations and for the collective interest of the international community. It is also important to look at the veto discussions in a holistic context and not only from the lens of categories of membership, but also from working methods discussions and accountability debates. It is indeed true that there are some P5 members who have not used the veto for several decades. This discussion is about the geopolitical realities of the world, which are not reflected in the Council and must be addressed, especially for the Global South. The G4 model focuses, therefore, on quality discussions rather than quantity and proposes new permanent members refraining from using the veto until the review to be conducted 15 years after the reform. Our proposal, I will also add, is a gesture as well of showing flexibility on the issue for a constructive negotiation. The question was, and the point was also raised by some members, and I will specify this, the G4 position on the veto vis-à-vis the common African position on the veto. Now, we all know that the common African position proposes abolishing the veto in the first place, but it also proposes that as long as it exists, the new permanent members should have the same responsibilities and obligations as the current P5 as a matter of common justice. Well, the G4 shares the idea of the common African position, and the G4 has made it clear that the new permanent members would, as a principle, have the same responsibilities and the same obligations as the current permanent members. And yet, at the same time, as I've already stressed, as a gesture of showing flexibility, the G4 proposes that the new permanent members shall not exercise the veto right until a decision on the matter has been taken during a review to be held 15 years after the coming into force of the reform. Therefore, I will say it is oversimplification and actually incorrect that there is a difference between the G4 position and the Common African position. In fact, the two positions are indeed very similar. We share the same goal, and if our approach does not work, we can fully support the Common African position as well on the veto. And we are happy to discuss further. Turning now to the review. I think many questions were raised from the floor on the review. I will say that the G4, and I will just quote this verbatim, in our model we have said that the situation created by the amendments to the Charter would be reviewed 15 years after their entry into force. Now, many of you have asked questions. What does this entail? Is it a one-off? What do you envisage in this review? Let me say that we believe it both necessary and natural that a huge transformation of a powerful institution, such as the UN Security Council, certainly requires periodic maintenance with necessary adjustments so that it can function better and fulfill its mandate. In this sense, as I said in the morning also, isn't it unusual that there has been no review for during the roughly 60 years since the last reform of the Council, which saw the addition, incidentally, of 4 non-permanent members, let alone the almost 80 years since the creation of the Council with 5 permanent members. And I will also add here that the G4 does not prejudge, and this is in response to questions from the floor, the G4 does not prejudge or exclude any possible conclusion of the review, including the categories of membership. By the way, as you all know, even without a review, any state may propose another charter amendment if necessary. And just to clarify very quickly also, our proposal is without prejudice to the review conference. Now, in response again to questions from the floor on the review, I will say that in our view, the G4 view, the purpose of the review is to examine the result of the proposed comprehensive reform, which is our proposal. Nonetheless, this is subject to negotiations at the intergovernmental discussions, and we are open, as I'm stressing again and again, we are open to further discussions. I also want to pick upon very quickly on some points that were raised in the morning with regard to the Common African position. I will stress again that the Common African position, both the Common African position and the G4 positions are very similar. The Common African position proposes abolishing the veto in the first place, as I've already said, but it also proposes that as long as it exists, the new permanent members should have the same responsibilities and obligations as the current P5. And I will reiterate here that the G4 shares this idea of the Common African position, and the G4 has made it clear as well that the new permanent members would, as a principle, have the same responsibilities and obligations as the current permanent members. However, as I've already repeated, please bear with me for this repetition. However, as a gesture of flexibility, the G4 proposes that the new permanent members shall not exercise the veto right until a decision on the matter has been taken during a review to be held 15 years after the coming into force of the reform. So therefore, as I said, this is an oversimplification. It is not strictly accurate that there is a difference between the G4 position and the Common African position on the veto. We share the same goal. And again, I stress and repeat that if our approach on this does not work, we can fully support the Common African position as well. And we are very happy to discuss this matter further. Very quickly, I will pick on some other points also. the issue of non-permanent seats. There was also something about a non-permanent seat for the Eastern European group. Well, no guesses here. The G4 supports a non-permanent seat for the Eastern European group. There was also some discussion, some very good points raised on improvement in the working methods of an expanded and reformed Security Council, and many of the suggestions that we heard from the floor were very similar, very, very similar to what the G4 has proposed, that at least once during their 2-year tenures, the E10 should at least once be presidents of the Security Council, that there should be greater coordination, there should be more ownership of subsidiary bodies by the elected members, including chairships, and we support all of that. So I see a lot of similarity between what all of you have been saying on improving the working methods of the Security Council and the G4 vision. So there is complete synergy there as far as I see. I would also like to stress on another point, which is very critical, and we should set the record straight, colleagues. It is about the increased representation of the Global South. It is about the increased number of voices on the top table, which will lead to a wider consensus and therefore better informed decision-making. And I think this point is very important to stress, and here I would say that the G4 model is very similar to the African model, because the commonality between the two is that for justice, for equity, to right the historical injustice, there should be an expansion in both categories. And as our colleague from Brazil mentioned in the morning, for reform to be truly a reform, truly transformative. One is a reform for reform's sake, and the other is a reform that is truly transformative in response to changing times, in response to a world that is vastly different, as we all agree, from 1945. For such a reform truly to be meaningful, it has to be an expansion in both categories. You have to look at the question of the veto. I've amplified upon that. You have to look at the improved working methods of the Security Council, and you also have to look at an improved relationship in the workings between the Security Council and the General Assembly and the Economic and Social Council. So I think the G4 model, the G4 vision, is very close to the African position, and that is a point that needs to be stressed. If you expand in the non-permanent category only, well, in that case, you move far away from the common African position. So to all our colleagues and friends who support an expansion in the non-permanent category only, I have 2 points here. One, that such a reform will not be truly transformative. And number two, how does it correct the historical injustice that has been meted to the Global South? How does it correct the historical injustice that has been meted to Africa? The expansion in the elected category only model ignores this very important reality, that the Global South and that Africa will therefore continue to be marginalized in decision-making. And we all know and we all agree that the majority of the issues in the Council today relate to the Global South, today relate to Africa. So, colleagues, that is a point that needed to be stressed, and I have said so. There were some questions on how open are we to revisions, to discussion. Well, I've said so many times. We are completely open to negotiations, completely open to discussions. I do believe that we can take this proposal forward in consultation with all of you in a very positive spirit. There was also, finally, I will round off by saying there was also a question of time frame that one member state did pose. And to that I will say, and also a couple of other colleagues said, why has our model not changed over the years? And at the same time, there was also a question on what is the time frame. Well, I will say, colleagues, why our model has not changed since 2015? Well, we are more than willing to begin text-based negotiations at the earliest. Given that we have the upcoming Summit of the Future, which is a rare opportunity to transform and reform, I would say that we should seize the moment and let us begin text-based negotiations so that through discussion, through dialogue with colleagues, and taking on board everyone's views, the model can further evolve and function and evolve in a way that will best suit the need of the United Nations today. So with that, I think perhaps I should stop. I've been overly long, my apologies, and I hand the podium back to you.
I thank the